She didn't move when his hand connected with her face. That was the thing no one could explain afterward. Not the doctors who witnessed it, not the nurses who looked away, not the administrator who stood there expecting her to crumple. Olivia Hart absorbed the blow the way a wall absorbs weather. Her head turned slightly with the impact, her jaw tightened, and then she looked back at him. Steady, quiet, eyes the color of winter slate, giving nothing away. The room held its breath. Administrator Douglas Vane had humiliated dozens of people in that building. He had made grown men cry in supply closets and forced competent nurses to resign with a few well-chosen words. He knew how to break people. He was good at it, but the woman standing in front of him didn't break. And that scared him more than anything else he'd seen in 20 years of running Hargrove Medical Center. If you've made it this far, don't stop now. Follow this channel so you don't miss what happens next. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Let's go. Iron Ridge, Colorado sat at an elevation that made newcomers lightheaded and kept the locals perpetually underestimated by everyone from the coast. The city had grown up around mining and stubbornness, and it wore both with a kind of grim pride. Hargrove Medical Center was its flagship institution, a sprawling regional hospital that served 4 counties, handled trauma from 2 major highway corridors, and operated under the assumption that it was far more sophisticated than it actually was. Olivia Hart had arrived there 11 months ago on a Tuesday in February, when the parking lot was sheeted with black ice, and the HR coordinator who processed her paperwork kept mispronouncing her name. She hadn't corrected him. She'd smiled, taken her badge, and found her locker in the women's changing room on the 3rd floor. Her file said she was 31 years old, a registered nurse with 6 years of clinical experience, 2 nursing certifications, and a 2-year gap in employment history she'd listed simply as private contractor work. The HR coordinator had noted the gap with mild suspicion, asked a few cursory questions, and let it go. Nurses were scarce. The gap wasn't unusual enough to flag. What her file didn't say, what no standard background check would surface without specific clearance codes and a direct inquiry to a federal database that most hospital administrators didn't know existed, was the rest of it. The 8 years before those 6. The assignments that didn't appear on any public record. The commendations that sat in a classified folder 3 levels below what civilian employers could access. None of that was in her file. Olivia had planned it that way. She worked the cardiac floor, which was understaffed by 2 nurses and functioned on a combination of mandatory overtime and collective denial about how close to collapse it perpetually operated. She was good at her job in a way that was efficient rather than warm. She remembered every medication interaction without checking the chart twice. She anticipated patient deterioration before the monitors flagged it, and she could start an IV on a dehydrated elderly patient in one attempt when other nurses needed 3. Her coworkers respected her in the way people respect someone reliable without quite knowing why they're so reliable. She didn't socialize much. She ate lunch alone, usually at her desk, reading. She had been there 11 months before Douglas Vane noticed her. His noticing was not a good thing. The training session had been scheduled for the wrong room. That was how it started. A scheduling error that put Olivia in the hospital's secondary conference room at the same time that Vane had booked it for a department heads meeting. She'd arrived early, set up the laminated procedure card she was reviewing for the quarterly competency check, and was sitting with a cup of coffee going cold beside her when the door opened and Vane walked in with 4 other people trailing him like a wake. He was 53, heavy-set, with the kind of face that looked perpetually aggrieved. He'd been administrator at Hargrove for 9 years and carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never been seriously challenged in a professional setting and had mistaken that for authority. He looked at Olivia. Then he looked at the laminated card spread across the table. "What is this?" he asked. "Competency review materials," she said. "I have the room booked from—" "This is my meeting space." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The people behind him had gone still the way people go still when they recognize what's about to happen. "Move your things." "I checked the schedule this morning. The room was—" "I don't care what the schedule said." He walked to her table, picked up one of her laminated cards, glanced at it, and dropped it back down with a particular kind of dismissal. Not careless, but deliberate. Communicating something. You're the cardiac floor nurse. Heart. Yes. I've been meaning to talk to you. He pulled out a chair and sat down across from her, which was an interesting choice. It said he wasn't going to make her leave immediately. He was going to do something worse first. Your charge nurse submitted a complaint about your patient documentation. Says you're not following protocol. Olivia's hands were flat on the table. I document in real time. The protocol is met. She says differently. Then I'd be happy to pull the records and go through them with you and the charge nurse together. Something shifted in his expression. He wasn't used to that. The calm counteroffer, the refusal to become defensive. He'd expected either apology or argument, both of which he knew how to use against people. I'm also hearing, he continued, that you've been advising patients on care decisions outside your scope. I answer patient questions within my knowledge and tell them to confirm with their physician. That's standard. That's not how it's been described to me. Then whoever described it to you described it incorrectly. The room had gone very quiet. The department heads who'd come in with Vane were standing near the door, not quite looking at Olivia and not quite looking away. Vane leaned back slightly. His next words were slower, more deliberate, each one placed with care. You've been here almost a year. You know what I notice about nurses who've been here almost a year and still haven't found their footing? They either adjust or they don't. And the ones who don't, he paused, they usually end up somewhere more suited to their abilities. Something smaller, less demanding. I found my footing, Olivia said. I don't think you have. He stood up. I think you're a competent floor nurse who has overestimated her position in this institution, and I think the documentation issue is going to require a formal review. He picked up one of her laminated cards again. This time, he didn't drop it. He held it. I'd start thinking about whether this is really the right fit for you. He was still holding the card when he reached out with his other hand. The slap was flat-palmed, not closed-fisted, the kind that was meant to humiliate rather than injure, aimed at the left side of her face. It happened fast, the way violence always happened, which was faster than anyone expected, and the sound of it, sharp, distinct, cut through the room like a blade. Olivia's head moved with the impact, just slightly, the way a tree bends in wind. Then she looked back at him. She did not raise her hands. She did not step backward. Her expression didn't shift into shock or pain or the particular crumpling that comes with unexpected violation. She just looked at him, and that look was not angry, which would have been easier for him to interpret. It was something older and much quieter than anger, and it made Douglas Vane take one involuntary step back before he caught himself. You don't belong here, he said. His voice had changed slightly, just slightly. Olivia said nothing. One of the department heads near the door cleared his throat. Nobody moved to intervene. Clear the room, Vane said. He meant Olivia. And expect the formal review notice by end of week. She gathered her laminated cards. She picked up her cold cup of coffee. She walked out of the room without hurrying, and the click of the door behind her was very quiet. The thing about Olivia Hart was that she'd been hit harder. Much harder. In places where being hit and not reacting wasn't composure, but survival. Where showing pain was information you couldn't afford to give. Where the calculation of response happened so deep in the body that it wasn't really a calculation anymore. It was just who she had become. She went back to the cardiac floor. She checked on her patients. She documented in real time. But something had shifted in the hospital by afternoon. The way things shifted in small, closed communities after a visible act of dominance. People who passed her in the corridor looked at her differently, some with sympathy that didn't quite extend to action, some with the particular careful blankness of people who've decided that what they witnessed wasn't their problem, a few with something that looked like relief that it had happened to someone else. Her charge nurse, Priya Vasanta, found her at the medication cart at 3:15. I need you to know, Priya said, keeping her voice low, that I didn't submit any complaint about your documentation. Olivia pulled a vial from the cart. I know. He fabricated it. I know that too. Priya was quiet for a moment, watching her. Priya was 44, had been a nurse for 19 years, and had survived 3 previous administrators at Hargrove. She recognized something in Olivia that she couldn't fully name, a kind of steadiness that didn't come from comfort or privilege, but from something earned in harder places. He's going to push you out, Priya said. He does it with nurses he can't control. He builds a paper trail. Manufactured complaints. He's done it before. I'm aware of how it works. Then what are you going to do? Olivia snapped the vial into the medication drawer with a soft, precise click. My job, she said. Priya looked at her for another moment, then walked away without saying anything else. There wasn't much else to say. The formal review notice arrived in Olivia's email the following Thursday, and it was worse than she'd expected. Not in its specifics, which were fabricated and therefore thin, but in its structure. Vane had clearly done this before. The complaint referenced 3 separate incidents with dates and vague descriptions that were impossible to specifically disprove without proving a negative, which was the point. The accompanying memo recommended a performance improvement plan with a 60-day monitoring period, during which she'd be observed by a supervisor who reported directly to Vane. It was a mechanism. It was designed to make her quit. She sat with the email for 4 minutes. Then she printed it, filed it in the folder she'd started keeping in her locker 3 days ago, and went back to her shift. That evening, she called a number she hadn't used in 8 months. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. She didn't leave a message. She sat on the edge of her bed in her apartment, small, sparse, the kind of space that held the minimum required for function, and looked at the wall. She'd left that world intentionally. She'd left it because she was tired in a way that sleep didn't fix, because she'd spent 8 years watching people make decisions with other people's lives as currency, and she'd needed to do something that was just useful, straightforward. A patient needed something, and you provided it. That was what she'd wanted. She hadn't wanted to be back in the middle of something. But Douglas Vane had made his choice, and choices, in Olivia's experience, had a way of traveling further than the person making them intended. 3 weeks after the formal review notice, a patient on the cardiac floor coded, room 412. Marcus Aldrin, 67, post-bypass, who had been doing well enough that the evening team had begun discussing possible discharge. The monitor alarm went at 9:47 p.m., a ventricular fibrillation pattern that the evening charge nurse registered a half-second later than she should have because she'd been in the middle of a phone call. Olivia was the first person through the door. What happened next took 11 minutes and was observed by 3 nurses, a respiratory therapist, and an overnight resident named Dr. Callum Reyes, who was 29 and 6 months out of residency and would describe it later, in the way that people describe things they've witnessed that don't match their existing categories, as unlike anything he'd seen. She didn't wait for direction. She didn't confer. She moved through the room with the kind of efficiency that wasn't urgency exactly, but something older and more certain than urgency. Compression position, depth, rate, transition to the AED with a timing that didn't pause, reading the rhythm strip with a single glance that told her something it took Reyes another 8 seconds to confirm. Her hands were absolutely steady. Her voice, when she gave direction to the other nurses, was calm and precise and carried no edge of panic. When Aldrin's rhythm converted at minute 9, the room exhaled. Reyes stood in the doorway and watched Olivia step back from the bed, pull off her gloves, and begin documenting. She didn't look at him. She didn't look at anyone. "You've run codes before," he said. It wasn't a question. "I've been in emergency situations," she said without looking up. He stopped. That was impressive. "The patient's stable. Let's make sure he stays that way." She finished her documentation and moved to the nurse's station. Reyes stood in the hallway for a moment longer, thinking about what he'd just seen, trying to place it in something he understood. He couldn't. Vane heard about the code response the following morning. His reaction, relayed secondhand to Priya by someone who'd been in his office when he got the report, was not what anyone would have expected. He wasn't impressed. He was annoyed. "Anyone would have done the same," he reportedly said. "She got lucky with the timing." The person in his office had apparently not responded to this. The performance improvement plan remained in place. Olivia's monitoring period continued. She worked her shifts, documented in real time, and said nothing about the code response when Vane's appointed supervisor asked her to justify her actions as possibly outside nursing scope. "I provided emergency intervention to a patient in cardiac arrest while waiting for the code team," she said. "That's within scope." The documentation suggests you took actions that should have waited for physician direction. The patient was in VFib. Waiting for physician direction would have resulted in irreversible brain damage. The supervisor, a thin man named Garrett, who had the look of someone who knew he was doing something he shouldn't, but had calculated the cost of refusal too high, wrote something on his notepad and moved on. Olivia watched him write it and said nothing. She had been patient. She was good at patience in the way people were good at things they'd had no choice but to practice. 8 years of operational environments where patience wasn't a virtue but a tactical necessity had calibrated her differently than most people in that building understood. What she hadn't anticipated was the second emergency. It arrived on a Wednesday afternoon at 2:23 p.m. in the form of a blue code broadcast over the hospital intercom, not on the cardiac floor this time, but in the administration wing, of all places. A visitor had collapsed in the corridor outside the executive offices. A man named Fletcher Malone, 64, who had been at the hospital for a meeting with Vane's team about a facilities contract and who was, though no one on the floor knew this yet, a retired 2-star general with an active security clearance and 3 government contacts currently en route to Iron Ridge. Olivia heard the code call while she was prepping medications at the cart. She was on her break, technically. The administration wing was 2 floors up. She went anyway. The corridor outside the executive offices was already crowded when she arrived. 2 nurses from a different floor, an administrative assistant pressing a folded jacket against the man's chest for reasons that were more instinctive than useful, and a security guard who had called 911 and was now standing at a slight remove, waiting for someone else to be responsible. Olivia assessed in approximately 4 seconds. The man was conscious but deteriorating, color wrong, breathing shallow and irregular, left hand gripping his own forearm, a particular pattern of distress that told her what she needed to know before she'd formally cataloged every indicator. I need a defibrillator, I need oxygen, and I need everyone except you. She pointed at one of the nurses. To step back and give me 3 feet. The nurse blinked. Are you authorized to? The man is going into cardiac arrest. Step back. She was already on her knees beside him. What happened next was observed by 11 people, including 2 of Vane's department heads who had emerged from the executive conference room at the sound of commotion. It lasted 6 minutes before the paramedics arrived. By that point, Olivia had stabilized the patient's condition enough that the lead paramedic, a woman named Torres who had 17 years of field experience, crouched beside her as they prepped for transport and said quietly, "Where did you train?" "Nursing school," Olivia said. Torres looked at her. "Right," she said, and didn't push it. As the paramedics loaded the gurney, one of Vane's department heads, a man named Harrison, whom Olivia recognized from the room where she'd been slapped, stepped toward her. "That was," he began. "Excuse me," Olivia said, and walked back toward the stairwell. She had made it to the second-floor landing when she heard something from the lobby below. Not a code call, something else. She paused on the stairs, listening. The sound of vehicle engines. Multiple. Heavy. She went down instead of up. The lobby windows faced the east parking lot, and through them, in the flat afternoon light of a Colorado Wednesday, Olivia watched a convoy of 3 military vehicles roll to a stop. 2 black SUVs and a government-plated sedan, moving with the particular unhurried precision of people who had anticipated exactly where they were going and exactly what they would do when they got there. She stood at the window. The lobby was busy. Patients in chairs, a family group near the information desk, 2 orderlies pushing an empty wheelchair toward the elevator bank. No one else was watching the parking lot. The doors of the vehicles opened. 4 people in military uniform, 2 in civilian clothes that carried the careful anonymity of federal credentials, moving with the quiet economy of people trained not to telegraph intention. They weren't running. They weren't stopping to read signage or ask directions. They already knew where they were going. One of them, a man in the lead, mid-40s, the kind of posture that came from rank held long enough to become physical, looked up at the hospital entrance and then, through the glass, directly at the lobby. His eyes found Olivia at the window. He stopped walking. For 1 second, across a parking lot and a pane of glass, they looked at each other. And in that second something passed between them that was recognition. Specific, bilateral, unambiguous. The kind that only existed between people who had shared the kind of experience that civilians had no framework for. Olivia stepped back from the window. Her heart rate, which had remained medically unremarkable through a cardiac code, a second emergency intervention, and a day of sustained institutional harassment, climbed for the first time. Not from fear. From the particular reckoning of a person who has been careful for a long time and who can feel, with absolute precision, the moment when careful stops being enough. She turned away from the window. Behind her, through the lobby doors, she could already hear the measured footsteps of people who had come a long way for a specific reason. They were coming inside. The footsteps stopped. Not because they'd reached a destination, because the man in the lead had held up one hand, a gesture so automatic it belonged to muscle memory rather than thought, and the people behind him had responded the same way. Olivia heard them pause just inside the lobby entrance before she'd fully turned from the window, and she stood very still in the middle of the corridor between the stairwell and the information desk and made the kind of rapid calculation that had kept her alive in places this building's entire administrative team would not have survived 3 hours in. She could keep walking, take the stairs back to her floor, clock back in from break, be in the middle of a medication round when they reached the nursing station. Make them come to her in a context she understood, surrounded by witnesses. Or she could turn around. She turned around. The man who had spotted her through the glass was named Donahue. She knew that before she read any identification, before he said a word. Colonel James Donahue, who had signed the extraction paperwork that got her out of a field hospital in a country she wasn't officially in, and who had sat across from her in a debrief room 4 years ago and told her, with the flat honesty she'd always respected in him, that the mission she'd just completed would never be acknowledged, and that the people whose lives she'd preserved would never know her name. She'd said that was fine, she'd meant it. He looked older, not dramatically, just the way people looked when time had continued without pausing to ask permission. There were other lines around his eyes, and his hairline had moved, and he was in dress uniform rather than the field gear she'd last seen him in, which meant this was official in a specific way that field gear wouldn't have been. "Hart," he said. "Colonel?" She didn't move toward him. "This isn't a place I expected to see you." "Believe me," he said, "it's not a place I expected to be." He looked at her the way people looked when they were deciding how much to say in a corridor, with an information desk 12 feet to the left and a security camera in the upper corner of the ceiling. "We need a room." "I'm on shift." "I know you're on shift." Something moved across his face, not impatience exactly, more like the look of a man who had driven 4 hours and flown 2 before that, and was now managing the residual tension of urgency with limited options. "This won't take long. It needs to be private." She studied him for another second. Behind him, the 2 civilians and 3 of the uniformed personnel were arranged with the practiced casualness of people who were professionally unobtrusive. The 4th uniformed person, a woman, late 30s, captain's insignia, was speaking quietly into a phone near the entrance. "There's a family consultation room on the 2nd floor," Olivia said. "Follow me." But the consultation room was small and smelled faintly of industrial cleaner and old grief, the particular combination of a space used repeatedly for difficult conversations that no amount of cleaning could fully neutralize. There were 6 chairs arranged around a low table, a box of tissues on the windowsill, and a framed print of mountains that Olivia had always found mildly aggressive in context. She closed the door. The captain with the phone stayed outside. The 2 civilians came in. Donahue sat, which was a signal. It said this was going to be a real conversation, not a quick extraction. "Fletcher Malone," Donahue said. "Is that the man who collapsed in the corridor?" "He's stable from what we're hearing, which is largely because of you." He folded his hands on the table. "Malone is a retired general. He's also a key witness in an active federal inquiry. I can't tell you into what, and before you ask, the clearance involved is above what I can discuss in this setting. What I can tell you is that his presence at this hospital today was not coincidental, and that the people responsible for his security are extremely interested in what happened to him in that corridor." "He had a cardiac event," Olivia said. "It was managed. He's stable." "I understand that. What I'm asking is whether anything about the event seemed unusual, whether anything in the environment, you think it wasn't spontaneous, Donahue didn't answer immediately, which was its own kind of answer. He's 64 with a documented cardiac history, Olivia said. I have no basis to say it wasn't spontaneous based on what I observed. But, she looked at him. I don't have a but. I have incomplete information, which is not the same thing. One of the civilians, a woman in her 40s with close-cropped hair and the kind of glasses people chose to look less intimidating than they were, leaned forward slightly. Ms. Hart, we're not here to make things difficult for you. We're here because you have a skill set and a history that makes you a credible observer in a situation where credible observers are scarce. I'm a nurse, Olivia said. The woman's expression shifted just slightly. Not a smile. Something more carefully controlled than a smile. We know what you are, she said. The room went quiet. Olivia looked at the mountain print. She had known, somewhere beneath the decision to come back to civilian life, that the line between the two wasn't as clean as she'd drawn it. She'd just hoped the evidence would take longer to arrive. What do you need from me? She said. Ita. What they needed was a written account of her clinical observations during the intervention, her assessment of Malone's presentation, anything she'd noticed about the corridor environment in the minutes before she arrived. It was the kind of request that was reasonable on its surface and carried significant weight underneath. She gave them what she knew, which was precise and brief, and she was careful to frame everything in observable clinical terms rather than speculation. It took 40 minutes. When they were done, Donahue walked her back to the stairwell while the others waited. How long have you been here? He asked, meaning the hospital, meaning Iron Ridge, meaning this smaller life. 11 months. He nodded slowly. They stopped at the stairwell door. You know I can't tell you what's happening, but I can tell you that Malone being here today means there are people with significant interest in this facility, not in your nursing work. He paused. In the administration. Olivia looked at him. I'm not asking you to do anything, he said. I'm telling you that things that seem local sometimes aren't. I know how that works, she said. Yeah. He looked at her for a moment with something in his expression that was close to apology without being quite willing to commit to it. Take care of yourself, Hart. I always do. She went upstairs. He went back to the consultation room. She returned to her medication cart, finished her round, documented everything, and did not think about what Donahue had said until she was in the car driving home, at which point she thought about almost nothing else. The following morning began with a summons. It came in the form of an email from Vane's assistant, brief, formally worded, requesting her presence in the administrator's office at 9 a.m. for what was described as a review of recent incidents. She read it twice at the nurse's station before her shift, then put her phone away and went to check on a patient who'd come in overnight with atrial flutter. The patient, a 70-year-old woman named Betts, who had strong opinions about hospital food and stronger ones about the morning news, was sitting up in bed when Olivia came in, looking considerably more alert than her chart suggested she should. You're the one who was with that man who collapsed yesterday, Betts said. I heard the nurses talking. How are you feeling this morning? Olivia said. Like I'm in a hospital, which is not great. Betts watched her with the sharp attention of someone who had lived long enough to read people sideways. They say you saved him. The paramedics stabilized him. That's not what they said. Betts tilted her head. You don't take compliments well, do you? I take them fine. I just don't misplace credit. Betts considered this. My late husband was like that. Military man. Couldn't let anyone make a fuss. She paused. Is that where you're from? Military? Olivia finished noting the overnight readings on the chart. I'm from nursing school, she said, which was the same answer she'd given the paramedic Torres, and which was becoming, through repetition, something close to a joke she was having only with herself. Betts made a sound that was somewhere between skepticism and amusement. Right, she said, in a tone that suggested she didn't believe a word of it, but was too polite to say so directly. At 8:55, Olivia walked to the administrative floor. Thus, Vane's office was large in the way that institutional offices were large, when the person occupying them had spent years making small decisions about space and furniture to communicate something about power. The desk was oversized. The chairs across from it were lower than ergonomics required. The window faced the parking lot rather than anything useful or pleasant, and the framed certificates on the wall were arranged with the particular density of someone who needed to be reminded of their own credentials. Garrett, the supervisor assigned to Olivia's monitoring period, was already there, sitting to the left of Vane's desk with a yellow legal pad, and the expression of a man who had walked into something he hadn't expected and was managing it poorly. Vane was standing when she entered, which was unusual. He was usually seated. It was a control mechanism, making people stand while he decided whether to acknowledge them. His standing meant something had altered the dynamic before she'd arrived. "Sit down," he said. She sat. He remained standing. He walked to the window, looked at the parking lot, and didn't speak for a moment. "There were military personnel in this building yesterday," he said finally. "I'm aware of that." He turned. "What did they want?" "I'm not in a position to discuss an ongoing federal inquiry," she said, which was technically accurate and strategically useful. His jaw tightened. "They came here specifically to speak with you." "I was available." "Why?" She looked at him steadily. "That's not something I can discuss with you." The silence stretched. Garrett was writing something on his legal pad that, from her angle, appeared to be the date and nothing else. "Let me be direct," Vane said, walking back toward the desk, not sitting, resting his hands on the edge of it. "I don't know what your history is. I don't know what you told those people. What I know is that this hospital has been operating under increased external scrutiny, and I will not have a floor nurse." He emphasized the word slightly, not loudly, creating situations that draw federal attention to my administration. "I didn't create anything," Olivia said. "A man had a cardiac event. I responded." "You responded outside your assigned area during a break without physician authorization, and then spent 40 minutes in a closed room with federal personnel. The patient was stable within 6 minutes. Everything else was clinical documentation. For a federal inquiry, I answered questions about a medical event. That's not unusual. In this hospital, it is." He straightened up. "I'm adding this incident to your performance file." Olivia looked at him. "Which incident specifically?" "Unauthorized intervention. Failure to notify supervising physicians." "I notified Dr. Reyes of my intervention on 4/12 2 days ago within—" "I'm talking about yesterday, the corridor. There was no physician present. The patient was in cardiac distress. The appropriate response was immediate intervention." "The appropriate response," Vane said, with the slow deliberateness he used when he wanted words to land like something physical, "is to know your place in this institution, and your place is not making unilateral decisions in my administrative corridor." The room was very still. Garrett had stopped writing. He was looking at his legal pad with the intensity of a man pretending to read something very interesting. "The performance review will also note," Vane continued, "that your conduct during the monitoring period has been consistently uncooperative and that I am recommending escalation to the regional board for consideration of—" "Mr. Vane!" He stopped. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't moved. But something in the way she said his name, without title, without inflection, with the flat specificity of someone who had decided to stop performing patients, made him stop. "I would recommend," she said, "that before you add anything to any file, you speak with your legal counsel." The silence that followed was a different quality than the ones before it. "Are you threatening me?" he said. "I'm giving you information," she said. "What you do with it is your decision." She stood up, smoothed her scrubs, and walked out of the office. Behind her, she heard Vane say something to Garrett in a low, sharp tone, and heard Garrett's response. Something indistinct and slightly strangled, the sound of a man who had just realized he'd been writing on a legal pad through something he would later be asked about. She went back to her floor. By noon, the hospital had changed, not visibly, not in any way that most people would have noticed. But Olivia noticed it the way she noticed early-stage deterioration in patients, through aggregated small signs that individually meant little and together meant something specific was happening. 2 of Vane's department heads had been in an unscheduled meeting since 10 a.m. His assistant had made 4 calls to the hospital's legal office that morning, which was 4 more than the assistant typically made in a week. Dr. Callum Reyes had been pulled into a conversation with the chief medical officer that lasted 20 minutes and left Reyes looking like he'd been asked a question he hadn't expected to answer. Priya found Olivia at lunch, the same small break room, the same cold coffee dynamic, though today Olivia was eating an apple and looking at nothing in particular. "Something's happening," Priya said, sitting down across from her. "Yep. Do you know what?" "Some of it." Priya pressed her lips together. "The people yesterday. The military people. Harrison came back from a meeting this morning looking like he'd been told something he didn't want to know. Harrison was in Vane's office when he—" Olivia stopped. "Harrison was present for an incident several weeks ago." Priya looked at her carefully. "He was in the room." "Yes. When Vane— Yes." Priya set down her coffee. "Olivia, if someone is looking into the administration, if those people yesterday, I can't tell you anything specific. I'm not asking for specific. I'm asking—" Priya lowered her voice, though the break room was empty. "Are we okay? The staff, is someone going to come in here and—" "I don't know the scope," Olivia said honestly, "but I don't think anyone's interest is in the nursing staff." Priya sat with that for a moment. "He's done this before. Vane. The documentation manipulation. There was a nurse 3 years ago, Margot Delacroix. She filed a complaint through HR and was out within 6 weeks. PIP, then termination. She was good. She was really good. Where is she now?" "Left medicine entirely. Last I heard she was working in administration somewhere, not clinical." Priya shook her head. "And there were others, before my time, I've been told. He has a pattern." "Patterns leave records," Olivia said. "Not if the records are managed." "They're never managed as completely as people think." Priya looked at her. "You sound very sure of that." "I've seen how these things work." She meant something specific by that, from a context Priya wouldn't have access to, but the principal translated. The break room door opened and a young nursing assistant looked in, made brief eye contact, and retreated without entering. The kind of unconscious deference to something she'd sensed in the room without being able to name it. "What do I do?" Priya said. "Do your job," Olivia said. "Document everything. Keep copies of anything that feels important." She paused. "And if anyone asks you about specific incidents, what you saw, what you heard, tell the truth exactly as it happened. Don't edit for the institution. Don't soften." Priya was quiet for a long moment. "That's harder than it sounds." "I know," Olivia said. "It's still the only thing that works." The escalation that Olivia had been calculating arrived at 2:40 p.m. in a form she hadn't anticipated. She was in the process of preparing a patient for discharge when her charge nurse badge paged her to the unit manager's office. Not Priya's office, but the floor manager above her, a man named Grover Haas, who had been with Hargrove for 14 years and who kept his head down so consistently that his neck had developed a permanent forward tilt. He was sitting behind his desk when she came in, and beside him, standing, was Garrett, and beside Garrett was a woman Olivia didn't recognize, his 50s, tailored jacket, the kind of lanyard that indicated HR rather than clinical. "We need to discuss your employment status," the HR woman said before Olivia had fully sat down. "All right," Olivia said. "Given the escalated performance concerns and in consultation with Mr. Vane's office, we're implementing a modified duty assignment effective immediately." The woman had a folder. She opened it on this table and turned it to face Olivia without quite pushing it across. "You'll be removed from primary patient care duties pending the completion of the formal review. You'll be assigned to administrative support functions on the 4th floor." Olivia looked at the document in the folder. It was a pre-prepared form, already formatted with her name and employee number, which meant it had been drafted before this meeting, likely before her conversation with Vane this morning, possibly before yesterday, which meant the escalation timeline was faster than she'd mapped. "Administrative support," she said. "Documentation assistance, supply chain coordination, administrative tasks. I'm a nurse. You'll retain your employment status while the review is completed." She looked at the form. It was designed to feel like an accommodation. You're not being fired, you're being reassigned, while functionally removing her from the clinical environment where her competence was visible and documented, and placing her in an administrative context where she had no established record and where any resistance could be framed as non-compliance. "I'd like to review this with legal counsel before signing," she said. The HR woman blinked. It was a small blink, quickly controlled, but it told Olivia that this response had been considered a possibility, and the team had decided most people didn't use it. You're certainly entitled to that. However, the modified duty assignment takes effect regardless of whether you sign. Your signature is acknowledgement, not consent. Then I'll acknowledge it after I've spoken with counsel, Olivia said. I'll also need a copy of the document for my records. A pause. We can provide that. Thank you. She stood. Am I still on shift for the remainder of today? Haas looked at the HR woman, who looked at Garrett, who looked at his legal pad. Given the circumstances, the HR woman said carefully, it would be appropriate for you to complete a handoff of current patients to another nurse, and then, I have 3 patients in the middle of care plans. Handing off mid-shift without appropriate transition creates risk. The transition will be managed. I'll complete a thorough handoff documentation. It will take approximately 90 minutes. She looked at Haas. I'm sure the floor manager agrees that patient safety protocols take precedence. Haas, whose primary professional skill was avoiding conflict, nodded in a way that committed him to nothing and confirmed everything. 90 minutes, the HR woman said. Thank you, Olivia said again. She went back to the floor and began writing the most thorough patient handoff documentation in the history of Hargrove Medical Center's cardiac unit. Every medication, every intervention note, every clinical observation, time-stamped, precise, complete. It was partly professional responsibility, it was partly something else. It was building a record, in the way she'd been trained to build records in environments where the record was eventually all you had. Priya found her 20 minutes into it and read over her shoulder for a moment without speaking. They're putting you on admin, Priya said. 4th floor. He's burying you. He's trying to. Olivia finished a section and moved to the next. There's a difference. Priya said nothing else, which meant she understood the distinction and wasn't sure she believed it and was giving Olivia the respect of not saying so. The handoff took 2 hours and 4 minutes, not 90 minutes, because 2 of the 3 patients had care developments in the interval that required additional documentation. Nobody challenged the timeline. The HR woman had gone back to her office. Garrett had left the building entirely. Haas stayed in his office with the door closed, which was his default response to anything that might require a decision. Olivia clocked out at 6:17 p.m. In the parking lot, she sat in her car for 3 minutes before starting it. The sky over Iron Ridge had gone the particular orange-gray of a Rocky Mountain evening that was more dramatic than it had any right to be, the clouds stacked above the ridge in a formation that belonged in a painting nobody had gotten around to making. She wasn't looking at the clouds. She was looking at her phone, at the email she'd drafted and not sent. She sent it. It was addressed to 4 people, 2 of whom were in government positions she couldn't name, one of whom was a labor attorney in Denver, whose name she'd been given 3 years ago by a colleague who'd said, keep this number somewhere, and one of whom was Donahue. It was a factual account of events from 11 months ago to the present day, with documentation attached, copies of every email, every performance notice, every nursing note she'd made during incidents Vane had subsequently described differently in his own records. The copies existed because she'd been making them since week 3, when the first comment about her documentation style had told her what direction things were moving. She had been patient. She had been thorough. She started the car and drove home. The following 3 days were, on the surface, quiet. She reported to the 4th floor at 7 a.m. each morning, was assigned tasks by an administrative coordinator named Felix, who seemed profoundly uncomfortable with her presence and gave her work in the determined manner of someone handing boxes to someone who clearly didn't need boxes but had been told this was the arrangement. She filed things. She coordinated supply orders. She reviewed documentation backlogs from the previous quarter. The documentation backlogs were interesting. She hadn't looked for anything. She was doing assigned work, which involved accessing the hospital's administrative records management system, which contained materials that the administrative coordinator had apparently not reviewed in some time because some of what she found in the course of routine assigned work was notable, not remarkable at first. She wasn't looking for remarkable. She was looking at vendor invoices and equipment maintenance logs and staffing reports. And what she was finding, in the gaps between those documents, were patterns that didn't resolve cleanly. Staffing reports that showed numbers inconsistent with what she knew from the floor. Equipment maintenance invoices paid to a vendor she didn't recognize, at intervals that didn't match the maintenance schedules posted on the equipment itself. HR complaint logs from the previous 4 years that showed a volume of staff complaints far higher than what had been included in any of the public-facing accreditation reports. She noted the specific documents. She didn't copy anything. That was a line she was careful about. She was doing assigned work, finding things in the course of assigned work, and noting what she found. That was different from searching for evidence. That distinction mattered. On the second evening, she called the Denver attorney, whose name was Rosamund Farr. "Tell me what you have," Farr said. Olivia told her. The silence on the other end had the quality of someone doing rapid calculations. "How long did you say you've been documenting?" "Since week 3 of my employment." "And the incident with the administrator, the physical contact. You documented that contemporaneously?" "Within 2 hours. Narrative account, physical description of the contact, location, witnesses present." "Who witnessed it?" Olivia listed them. "Okay," Farr said. "Don't touch anything else in those admin records without my explicit guidance. What you've already found is potentially significant, but I need to know exactly how you accessed it." "Assigned work. I have the coordinator's email directing me to the system and the specific task." "Good." Farr paused. "The federal inquiry you mentioned. Are you in contact with those people?" "I have a contact number." "Call it tonight. Tell them what you found in the admin records. Don't describe it in detail. Just flag it as potentially relevant to whatever they're looking at. Let them make the connection." "You think they're connected?" "I think a senior hospital administrator targeting a staff member who stumbled onto financial irregularities is a story I've heard before," Farr said. "And I think the version where the federal interest in the hospital and the interest in you are separate things is less likely than the version where they're not." Olivia sat with that. "All right," she said. "Call me tomorrow after you talk to your federal contact," Farr said. "And Hart, don't go back to those records without documentation." "I know how to document," Olivia said. "Yes," Farr said. "I'm beginning to understand that." She called Donahue at 9:15. He answered on the second ring, which meant he'd been waiting for her call or something like it. She described what she'd found briefly and specifically. He was quiet for longer than she expected. Then, "How recent are the staffing report discrepancies?" "The most recent is from this quarter." "And the vendor?" "Invoices going back 2 years, paid quarterly." Another pause. "Don't access those records again." "My attorney said the same thing." "Your attorney is correct." She heard something in the background. A door, voices, someone saying something she couldn't catch. "Hart, what you've described is consistent with something we've been building toward. I can't tell you specifics, but I need you to understand that the timeline may accelerate from here." "How much?" "Days, not weeks." She looked out her apartment window at the dark ridge of mountains against the lighter dark of the sky. "What does that mean for me specifically?" "It means don't do anything that looks like you're building a case. Don't access additional records. Don't discuss this with colleagues." He paused. "And don't let Vane escalate your situation further. If he makes another move against your employment, contact Farr immediately and copy me." "You know about Farr?" "She's good," he said, which wasn't an answer to the question she'd asked and was a complete answer to it. She hung up. She sat very still in the middle of her apartment, in the quiet that was beginning to feel less like stillness and more like the specific pressure of something about to move. The move came on the 4th day. Not from Vane. From Harrison. Harrison, the department head who had been in the room when Olivia was struck, who had subsequently been in the meeting that left him looking unsettled, who had not spoken a direct word to her since, stopped her in the corridor of the 4th floor at 8:40 a.m. while the administrative coordinator Felix was on the phone in his glass-walled office and not watching. Harrison was 51, gray at the temples, with the look of a man who had been moderately ambitious in his 30s and had settled for comfortable in his 40s, and was now, at 51, confronting the cost of the deal he'd made. "I need to tell you something," he said. Olivia looked at him. "What happened in that room?" he said. "With Vane. I should have—" He stopped. His jaw worked. I should have said something. Yes, she said. You should have. He flinched slightly. She hadn't said it unkindly, but she hadn't softened it either. There's a camera, he said, in the corner of that conference room. It's one of the facility security feeds. I didn't know if anyone had checked it. I don't know if Vane knows it was running. Olivia had known about the camera. She'd seen it when she entered the room and noted its position relative to the table, and made a silent calculation about what it would and wouldn't capture. She hadn't mentioned it to anyone, because mentioning it would have revealed that she'd noticed it, which would have changed how Vane approached whatever came next. Thank you for telling me, she said. I know it doesn't... Harrison stopped again. He was a man who had too many unfinished sentences this morning. It doesn't fix what I didn't do. No, she agreed. It doesn't. She walked away from him and found a bathroom that was out of line of sight from the administrative offices and called Rosamond Farr, who answered on the third ring with the alertness of someone who'd been expecting contact. Security camera in the conference room where the incident occurred, Olivia said. A witness is telling me it was running. He's willing to talk. Farr's pause was brief. Can he access or confirm the footage exists without triggering the administration? I don't know his access level. Find out. Don't ask him to retrieve anything. Just find out if he knows whether it's been accessed, reviewed, or if there's any indication Vane's team knows about it. All right. And Olivia. Farr's voice had changed slightly, something more direct underneath the professional tone. This is moving faster than I expected. I've been in contact with people who I'm not going to name, but who have indicated that what you flagged to your federal contact last night was significant. More significant than I initially assessed. Donahue said days. Donahue may be optimistic, Farr said. I think it might be hours. The bathroom was completely quiet. Somewhere down the corridor, a phone rang and was answered. What do I do right now? Olivia said. Right now. Go back to your assigned work. File things. Coordinate supply orders. Do nothing that looks anything other than exactly what they put you there to do. And wait. And wait, Farr confirmed. You've spent months building this. Don't let the last few hours undo it. Olivia put her phone in her pocket and looked at herself in the bathroom mirror for a moment, not examining anything, just the quick inventory of a person checking that they're still intact before walking back into something. She looked the same as she'd looked every morning for 11 months. Slightly tired, steady, unremarkable in the way she'd trained herself to be unremarkable, which had never been her natural state, but had become a kind of armor she'd worn long enough that she sometimes forgot it was armor. She went back to the 4th floor. She filed things. She coordinated supply orders. At 11:47 a.m., every phone on the floor rang at the same time. She was reaching for a supply manifest when the sound hit. Not a code call, not a standard page, but the full facility emergency alert tone that she'd heard tested twice since arriving at Hargrove and never activated in a real event. It came through the ceiling speakers and the phone system simultaneously, and it was followed, 2 seconds later, by a voice she didn't recognize announcing a mass casualty alert and requesting all available clinical personnel to report to the emergency department immediately. Mass casualty. Olivia was already moving before the announcement finished. She was halfway to the elevator when she remembered she'd been removed from clinical duties. She stopped, looked at the elevator, thought about what mass casualty meant in a regional hospital that served 4 counties and 2 major highway corridors. She took the elevator. The emergency department was controlled chaos, the functional kind, where the chaos served a purpose and people were moving with intention even when they were moving fast. But the sheer volume of incoming was already straining the available personnel. She could see it from the doorway, 3 ambulances in the bay, a 4th incoming, the triage area filling faster than the assessment team could process, the trauma bays at capacity. Dr. Reyes was at the central desk, on 2 phones simultaneously, looking like a man trying to hold a structure together with not quite enough hands. He saw her in the doorway. Heart. He said it with the exact tone of someone who had been trained to say there are protocols and understood in this specific moment that the protocols were insufficient. You're on modified duty. Yes, she said. He looked at the triage area. He looked at her. Multi-vehicle accident on Route 9, he said. 14 confirmed, possibly more. We have 2 trauma nurses and 1 attending. She was already moving toward the supply cabinet for gloves. I didn't send for you, he said, loudly enough that it would register to whoever was watching. I know, she said. She went to the nearest patient. Upashu. What happened in the next 90 minutes was something that Dr. Reyes would attempt to write up accurately 3 times before concluding that accurate description required a vocabulary he didn't quite have. She worked the triage line with the systematic thoroughness of someone who had done mass casualty sorting in conditions that made a highway accident response look organized. She didn't direct unless direction was needed. She didn't take over. She worked within the available structure and consistently positioned herself where the available structure had gaps. The lead trauma physician, Dr. Anwar Solano, a compact woman in her late 40s who had seen most things, arrived 18 minutes in and took one look at the operational state of the emergency department, and then one look at Olivia and said, "Who are you?" "Cardiac floor nurse," Olivia said. "On modified duty reassignment." "You're not on modified duty in my emergency department," Solano said. "What do you have?" They worked together like they'd trained together, which they hadn't, which was the thing that Reyes kept coming back to later when he tried to explain it to people. The collaboration had the quality of people who shared a professional language that most people in that building didn't speak. At the 90-minute mark, with the immediate crisis stabilized, 2 patients transferred to surgical and the remaining triage process to manageable, Olivia stepped back from the central desk and looked at the emergency bay. Solano was at her elbow. "I'm putting your work today in the incident report," she said. "I was on modified duty. You were responding to a mass casualty alert, which is a facility-wide emergency protocol that supersedes departmental assignments." Solano looked at her steadily. "That's how I'll document it." Olivia looked at her. "How long have you actually been a nurse?" Solano said. The question landed differently than the same question from Torres or Reyes, because Solano asked it the way someone asked a question they already half knew the answer to and were checking their own read against reality. "A while," Olivia said. Solano looked at the bay. "You have a distinctive way of sorting, the way you triage the first 6 patients, that sequence. Most trauma nurses don't sequence like that. It's efficient. It's also how military medics sequence in multi-casualty environments." Solano said it matter-of-factly, not accusingly, the way a person stated something they'd observed. "I know because my sister did 2 tours and I asked her to walk me through field triage once. The prioritization logic is different from civilian training." Olivia said nothing. "I'm not asking," Solano said. "I just want you to know that the people who are worth impressing in this building aren't easily impressed, and you did it today." She walked back to her patients. Olivia stood in the middle of the emergency bay for a moment, in the noise and the controlled residual urgency of a department coming down from a mass casualty response, and felt something she recognized but didn't often experience, the specific discomfort of being seen accurately by someone she respected. She went to the bathroom. She washed her hands for longer than strictly necessary. When she came back out, there was a security guard waiting for her. Not from the emergency department. He was from the administrative level. She recognized the specific badge configuration, and he had the look of a man who had been given a task he found distasteful. "Ms. Hart," he said, "Mr. Vane's office is requesting your presence." "Now?" She looked at the emergency bay behind her. "Immediately." He paused. "I was told to escort you." She looked at the guard, who was maybe 26 and clearly wished he were somewhere else. He hadn't done anything to her. She had no reason to make his day worse. "All right," she said. They walked to the elevator. As the doors closed, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She didn't take it out. She knew without looking that it was either Farr or Donahue, and she knew without reading it what it would say, because she could feel, with the particular precision of someone who had spent years reading the moment before something happened, that the thing she'd been waiting for was finally arriving. The elevator rose. The doors opened on the administrative floor. And standing outside Vane's office, in the corridor, in full-dress uniform, was Colonel James Donahue. And beside him, the woman with the close-cropped hair and the carefully non-intimidating glasses, who was holding a document in a federal folder, and whose expression said that whatever was in that folder had already made this day irreversible. Vane's office door was closed. From behind it came the sound of raised voices, Vane's voice, and at least two others she didn't recognize. Donahue looked at Olivia across the corridor. He didn't smile. He didn't signal reassurance. What he did was the small, deliberate nod of someone acknowledging that a very long sequence of events had reached its hinge point, and that everything on the other side of the door was going to be different from everything that had come before. The voices behind the door rose sharply, then stopped. The door opened from the inside. Not because anyone knocked, because the federal investigator who had been in Vane's office for the past 11 minutes had apparently reached the point in the conversation where the door needed to be open, which was a specific tactical choice. Open doors meant witnesses, and witnesses meant accountability. And accountability was precisely what Douglas Vane had spent 9 years engineering his environment to avoid. He looked older than he had 3 days ago. That was the first thing Olivia registered. Not physically different, but the quality of his presence had changed. The particular compression that happened to people when the structure they'd built around themselves began to crack at load-bearing points. He was standing near his desk. He wasn't leaning on it this time. There were 2 investigators in the office she didn't recognize, both in civilian clothes, both with the lanyard configurations of federal identification. One of them, a tall man with a notepad who had the unhurried demeanor of someone who had done this many times, looked at Donahue as he entered, then at Olivia, and gave a small nod that confirmed something she hadn't been told directly. She was not a subject. She was a witness. That distinction had just been made visible in a room where Vane could see it. "Ms. Hart." The tall investigator gestured toward the chair Vane usually made subordinates stand in front of. "Please sit." She sat. Vane remained standing. Nobody offered him a chair. "Mr. Vane has been informed," the investigator said, with the flat precision of a man reading from a mental index card, "that this office is the subject of a federal inquiry into financial irregularities, fraudulent accreditation reporting, and the systematic targeting of clinical staff. He's been advised of his rights, and his legal counsel has been contacted." The investigator paused. "We have the security footage from the conference room on the 3rd floor. The footage from 6 weeks ago." The room absorbed that. Vane's jaw was tight. Whatever his attorney had told him on the phone in the last 20 minutes had apparently included the possibility of this, because he didn't react with surprise. He reacted with the contained fury of a man who had known a thing was coming and had hoped his knowledge would somehow prevent it from arriving. "That footage," the investigator continued, "along with witness accounts from 5 individuals present in the room, is being entered as evidence in a parallel HR investigation that will be conducted by an independent body, not this hospital's internal processes." He turned to Olivia. "I need you to confirm for the record that the incident the footage depicts occurred as it appears." "Yes," she said. "You did not provoke physical contact." "No." "The individual who made physical contact was Douglas Vane, the person currently in this room." "Yes." Vane made a sound, not a word, something that wanted to be an objection and couldn't find the language. "Thank you," the investigator said to Olivia. He looked at Donahue. "Colonel, we have what we need for this stage." Donahue looked at Vane. He didn't speak, which was more uncomfortable than speaking would have been. The look of a senior military officer who had come a long distance and found exactly what he'd expected to find, which was not a vindication but a confirmation of something that should never have needed confirming. "I want to be very clear," Vane said. His voice had the tightly controlled quality of someone managing a response they knew was being recorded. "Whatever she's told you, this is a disgruntled employee who has consistently violated protocol." "Mr. Vane," the investigator said it without inflection, "I'd encourage you to direct further statements to your legal counsel." The silence that followed was the kind that had weight. Olivia stood. The investigator gestured toward the hallway, and she walked out, and the door was left open behind her. And she stood in the corridor outside the office of the man who had hit her and listened to the formal, procedural language of consequences beginning to move. The hallway was quieter than it should have been for mid-morning. She would learn later that Harrison had quietly informed 3 of the other department heads about what was happening, not because he was brave, but because he was strategic, and he'd calculated correctly that proximity to Vane in the next few hours was a liability. Donahue came out 2 minutes later. The woman with the close-cropped hair was already on her phone, walking toward the elevator. "The footage is clear," Donahue said, stopping beside her. Not beside her the way someone stood beside a subject. The way someone stood beside a colleague. "Better than clear. I didn't know if the angle would capture it fully. It did." He paused. "The financial records your attorney flagged. Far coordinated with our team this morning. The vendor invoices alone represent a pattern going back 7 quarters. That's not sloppiness. That's intent." "I know." She'd known from the 3rd invoice she'd found, but she'd needed the pattern to be complete before it meant what she thought it meant. "Malone," Donahue said the name carefully. "His collapse. It was cardiac. Confirmed. Not external cause, but the reason he was at this hospital at all, the specific meeting Vane's office had scheduled with him." He stopped. "That's part of what's under seal, but I can tell you that Malone's testimony about that meeting is going to be significant. He was investigating the hospital. He was connected to people who were." Donahue looked at her. "You didn't know that when you intervened." "No. You just responded." "He was in cardiac distress," she said. It was a complete sentence. Donahue was quiet for a moment, then, "The modified duty assignment. The documentation Vane built against you. All of it is part of the evidentiary record now. The independent HR investigation will address your employment status. FAR will be in contact today." "All right." He looked at her the way he'd looked at her in the debrief room 4 years ago, with the specific calculation of a man reassessing something he thought he understood. "You've been building this case for 11 months. "I've been doing my job for 11 months, she said. "The case built itself." He almost smiled. "Not quite." "That's a distinction." "It matters." "I know it does." He straightened slightly. "There's one more thing. The staff who were targeted before you, Delacroix and 3 others whose names have come up in the investigation, their records are being reviewed. The findings against them were manufactured using the same template Vane used on you." Something moved through Olivia that wasn't satisfaction exactly, closer to the feeling of a long-held breath being released, which wasn't pleasant in the immediate moment, but was necessary. "How long before that's resolved?" she said. "Weeks, not months. The pattern is clear enough that the independent body won't need extended review." He paused. "You should know that Dr. Solano submitted her own statement this morning about the mass casualty response. She was direct. She usually is. She wrote that you operated with a level of clinical command that she'd only seen in 2 other contexts in her career. One was a major urban trauma center. The other was an embedded field hospital." He said it evenly. She didn't speculate beyond that. Olivia looked at the closed door of Vane's office. From behind it came the sound of low voices, the measured, methodical cadence of an official process that had stopped being stoppable. "What happens to him now?" she said. "That's not determined here." Donahue said it as a fact, not a reassurance. "The financial inquiry alone warrants federal prosecution. The workplace conduct, that goes to the state board and the independent review. His licensing is separate from the criminal question." "So, multiple tracks?" "Simultaneously, yes." He looked at her. "He's not walking away from this. I want you to understand that, because I know you've been operating without that certainty for 11 months. She understood it. She let it land. From inside the office, Vane's voice rose briefly. Not words, just the pitch of a man reaching the edge of containment, and then fell again. "I have to brief the team," Donahue said. He extended his hand, which was a formal gesture and also something else. She shook it. He walked toward the elevator. Olivia stood alone in the corridor for 30 seconds, which was not a long time and felt like the end of something and the beginning of something else simultaneously, which was how those moments usually felt in her experience. Then her phone rang. It was a number she didn't recognize. Not Farr, not Donahue, not any contact she'd established in the past 11 months. An Iron Ridge area code. She answered. "Is this Olivia Hart?" A woman's voice. Young, slightly unsteady. "My name is Delacroix, Margot Delacroix. Rosamond Farr gave me your number." A pause. "They called me this morning. The investigators. They said my case is being reopened." Olivia closed her eyes briefly. "Ms. Delacroix," He destroyed my career. The voice had gone very flat. 3 years ago. I had everything documented, and it didn't matter. He made it disappear. I left medicine because I couldn't. She stopped. They're telling me now that there are 5 of us, that this goes back further than I knew. There are at least 5, Olivia said quietly. Possibly more. How did you... A longer pause. How did you not let him break you? Olivia looked at the closed door of Douglas Vane's office, behind which the sound of a measured procedural reckoning continued its work. I've been in worse places than this, she said honestly, and I've seen what happens when you stop moving, so I kept moving. Margot Delacroix was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that Olivia didn't entirely hear, because at that exact moment the door to Vane's office opened again, and the tall investigator stepped out with a second person behind him. Not Vane, but a man in a suit she'd never seen, who had the expression of legal counsel who had just been handed a situation significantly worse than his client had represented. And behind both of them, Vane himself. He looked at Olivia. The corridor was narrow enough that there was no avoiding it, no angling away, no pretending the eye contact hadn't happened. He was 2 years of power and 9 years of accumulated certainty, and he was looking at the woman he had struck across the face in a conference room and expected to disappear, and she was still here, still standing, and the people flanking him were not his people. His face did something complicated. Not guilt. She didn't think Douglas Vane had the architecture for guilt in the way most people understood it. More like the particular reconfiguration of a man who had based a long sequence of decisions on a fundamental misread of who he was dealing with. She held the eye contact. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. He looked away first. They walked him toward the elevator. The investigator glanced at her as he passed and gave the same small nod as before, which this time communicated something different, something more like completion than confirmation. The elevator doors opened. They stepped in. The doors closed. Olivia stood in the empty corridor with Margot Delacroix still on the phone, and she was about to speak when she heard from the direction of the stairwell rapid footsteps, multiple sets, moving fast. Dr. Solano came around the corner at a pace that was 1 step short of running, and behind her, Dr. Reyes, and behind him, a nurse Olivia recognized from the emergency department. And Solano's expression, when she saw Olivia, was not relief. It was the specific controlled urgency of a physician who had news that needed to be delivered without the delivery making things worse. One of the mass casualty patients, Solano said, reaching her. Male, 43, second trauma bay. We stabilized him in the ED. He went to surgical. She stopped, recalibrated. He just coded in post-op. The surgical team is in there, but Reyes flagged something in the pre-surgical triage notes. Something about the presentation sequence that... She looked at Olivia. You triaged him. You were the first assessment. Room 3, Olivia said immediately. Seatbelt contusion pattern. Asymmetric breath sounds on the right. I noted it in the triage documentation. There's an internal bleed. Surgical missed it on the initial imaging because of artifact on the scan. They're in there now, but the attending is asking... Solano stopped again. He's asking if you noted anything about the vascular presentation that isn't in the written triage. Olivia was already moving. Solano matched her pace. Olivia, the surgical attending is Dr. Harmon. He has 30 years. He doesn't ask for input from triage nurses. I know. He's asking for you specifically. She pushed through the stairwell door. The patient was 43 years old and his name was on a wristband she'd looked at during triage. And she remembered his presentation the way she remembered all of them, not as facts filed, but as a picture that had registered with the particular completeness of a mind trained to read bodies as operational landscapes. The breath sounds, the pressure differential, the thing that wasn't quite in the written note because she'd run out of time before the surgical team arrived and had told herself the documentation was sufficient. She took the stairs 2 at a time. Behind her, Reyes said something to Solano that she didn't hear. Solano said, She's already gone. The surgical suite was on the 3rd floor, and she hit the door at a pace that made the scrub nurse near the entrance step back instinctively before registering that the person coming through wasn't a threat, but something more urgent than that. Dr. Harmon was 61, broad-shouldered, with the particular economy of movement that came from 3 decades of keeping his hands steady under pressure. He was at the table. The patient's chest was open. The monitors showed a rhythm that was working harder than it should have been, and the anesthesiologist at the head of the table had the focused stillness of someone managing a situation with insufficient margin. Harmon looked up when Olivia came in. He didn't ask who she was. Solano had apparently called ahead, or he'd already known, because he just said, "You triaged him. Walk me through the vascular presentation, specifically the upper quadrant." She was already at the viewing screen where the imaging was pulled up. Asymmetric breath sounds right side, diminished but not absent. Tracheal position was midline. I checked twice because the breath sound pattern suggested otherwise. Blood pressure was compensating at triage, 112/74, but the pulse pressure was narrow, 22. Harmon's hands didn't stop moving. Narrow pulse pressure, compensated BP, asymmetric breath sounds. The scan showed the rib fractures, but the vascular shadow in the upper right quadrant was obscured by artifact from the rib. I didn't want to flag a vascular injury I couldn't confirm without keeping him from surgical. I documented the pressure differential. You thought hepatic? I thought hepatic, or a high intercostal vessel. The mechanism, he was the driver, airbag deployed, seat belt across the right shoulder at an angle. The force vector was wrong for a clean rib fracture pattern. Harmon made a sound that wasn't agreement and wasn't disagreement. He was looking at something inside the patient's chest that Olivia couldn't see from her angle, and his hands moved in the specific, deliberate way of a surgeon who had just found what he was looking for. "There," he said, more to himself than anyone. Then to his resident, "Right intercostal artery, partial laceration. It's been bleeding slowly since admission. Small enough to compensate, big enough to eventually not." He looked up at Olivia. The pressure differential was the tell. "Yes. You should have put it in the documentation." "I should have," she said. It wasn't a deflection. It was accurate. He looked at her for one more second, the look of a man recalibrating, then went back to the patient. "You can stay or go. Either way, I have what I need." She stayed for 4 minutes until the vessel was addressed and the rhythm on the monitor settled into something more sustainable, and then she left without being asked to. She went back through the stairwell door and sat on the 3rd step from the bottom for approximately 45 seconds, which was not something she'd planned, but her legs had made a unilateral decision and she honored it. Her hands were steady. They were always steady, even when the rest of her wasn't. She stood back up. She went back to work. By 3 p.m., Hargrove Medical Center had become 2 different places existing in the same building simultaneously. On the clinical floors, the mass casualty response was winding down to its aftermath. The documentation, the family notifications, the transfer coordination, the particular exhaustion of staff who had sprinted for 90 minutes and were now running on whatever was left. That world was functioning, imperfect and tired, and getting its patients through. On the administrative floor, something else entirely was occurring. Rosamund Farr had arrived in person at 2:15, which told Olivia, when Priya relayed this, breathless, during a supply run, that the situation had moved past phone call management into physical presence management, which meant the documentation was complete enough to act on, and the acting had begun. Farr was 47, not physically imposing, with the kind of quiet authority that people mistook for softness until they were across a table from her. She had spent 20 years in labor and employment law with a particular emphasis on institutional misconduct, and she carried a rolling document bag that, on this occasion, was substantially fuller than usual. She met Olivia in the second-floor family consultation room at 3:20, same room as Donohue's meeting 2 days ago. The box of tissues on the windowsill, the mountain print. "The independent HR investigation has been formally initiated," Farr said, sitting down and opening the document bag with the efficiency of someone who had been moving at this pace for hours. "External body. No institutional affiliation with Hargrove. They'll interview all identified witnesses within 48 hours. The scope has expanded beyond your case. Delacroix. Delacroix, and 2 others we've confirmed. A respiratory therapist named Quaid and a charge nurse from the surgical floor named Brecca, who resigned 14 months ago. There's a 4th potential complainant who hasn't committed yet." Farr pulled a folder from the bag and set it on the table between them. The documentation pattern is consistent across all four. PIP initiated within weeks of a complaint or conflict with Vane. Fabricated supporting complaints. Rapid escalation. In all cases but yours, the target resigned before the process completed. He picked people he thought would leave, Olivia said. Yes. Farr looked at her. He was wrong about you. He didn't know enough about me to be right. That's a generous read. It's an accurate one. She looked at the folder. What's in there? Your modified duty assignment is being challenged on procedural grounds. The documentation supporting it was fabricated, which the independent body can verify against the actual nursing records. You'll be reinstated to clinical duties effective tomorrow morning, subject to confirmation. Farr paused. I want you to understand that reinstatement isn't guaranteed until the independent body confirms it. There's a 24-hour window. I understand. The federal side is moving separately. The financial inquiry, I've spoken with Donahue's contacts. The vendor invoice pattern you identified was the piece that connected two pre-existing threads in their investigation. They had circumstantial evidence of accreditation fraud. Your discovery gave them the financial mechanism. Those two threads together constitute a case that's substantial. Olivia looked at the table. He was billing for staff that weren't there. The staffing discrepancies you found in the records show approximately $45,000 per quarter in billing for clinical hours that don't correspond to actual staff deployment. Over 7 quarters, that's significant federal fraud exposure. Combined with the accreditation reporting, submitting safety metrics to the regional board that don't match actual incident data, he's looking at multiple federal charges. Farr closed the folder. His legal counsel has already made contact about cooperation, which means he knows the case is solid. He's going to try to reduce his exposure. He's going to try, Farr said. The degree to which that works depends on what he has to offer, and given the scope of what we're looking at, he may not have enough. Olivia was quiet for a moment. The security footage has been reviewed by the independent investigators and entered into the record. It's clear. Multiple camera angles. There was a second camera in the corridor outside the conference room that captured the timestamp in your entry and exit, which establishes the context. Farr looked at her directly. The footage of the physical contact, combined with the witness accounts, constitutes a straightforward case of workplace assault by a person in a supervisory position. That's a criminal matter separate from the employment case. Separate track. Yes. The DA's office in this county received a referral this morning from the federal investigators. They're obligated to refer the assault evidence to local prosecution. Whether the DA pursues it is their decision, but the referral is on record. Olivia sat with all of this, not processing it exactly. She'd been building toward it for long enough that the information wasn't surprising, more like feeling the weight of it, which was different from understanding it. What do I need to do right now? She said. Nothing, Farr said. For the first time in 11 months, the correct action is to let the process work. Go back to your floor. If the independent investigators contact you tonight, call me before you respond. Otherwise, she almost smiled. Take a breath. You're telling a former combat medic to take a breath. I'm telling a very tired person who has been holding everything together by herself for nearly a year, Farr said, that she doesn't have to anymore. The room was quiet. Okay, Olivia said. It came out slightly rougher than she intended. Okay, Farr confirmed. Yet, she went back to the cardiac floor, not because she'd been cleared for clinical duties yet. She hadn't, technically, but because the 4th floor administrative assignment had been verbally suspended pending the independent review, and nobody had told her explicitly to stay away from cardiac, and the floor was short-staffed coming off the mass casualty response, and Priya was there. Priya didn't say anything when Olivia walked in and picked up a chart. She just moved to make room at the nursing station, which was its own kind of statement. At 4:45, Priya said, Harrison resigned. Olivia looked up. Submitted it to the board about an hour ago, effective immediately. Priya was watching a monitor, not quite looking at Olivia. He sent an email to the department heads. I don't know what it said, but Garrett apparently sat in his car in the parking lot for 30 minutes after reading it. Garrett will cooperate with the investigation, Olivia said. He doesn't have the spine for anything else. That's not charitable. It's not meant to be. It's useful. She went back to the chart. He was in the room when Vane hit me. He was in the meeting where the modified duty assignment was discussed. His testimony corroborates the documentation. Priya was quiet for a moment. Are you okay? The question was simple enough that it landed harder than a complicated one would have. Ask me that in about a week, Olivia said. Okay. Priya went back to her monitor. The patient from the ED bets. She's been asking about you. I'll check in before end of shift. She did, at 6:15, stopping in room 408, where Betts was sitting up with a crossword puzzle and the particular alert quality of a woman who had been monitoring the hospital's general atmosphere all day and drawing conclusions. You've had quite a day, Betts said. Routine day, Olivia said, checking the monitor readout. My late husband used to say that too. Betts put the crossword down. Usually said it after something that was very much not routine. She paused. There are people on the administrative floor. I can see them from the window. Men in suits. That military man came back. I know. Is it going to be all right? For the staff here, I mean. Not you specifically. The nurses. The people who work here. Olivia looked at her. It's going to be more all right than it was yesterday, she said carefully. That's the most honest thing I can tell you. Betts considered this and apparently found it sufficient. She picked up her crossword. Good enough, she said. The official staff notification went out at 8 p.m. after Olivia had clocked out and was in her car in the parking lot checking her phone. It was sent by the acting administrator, a title that had apparently been assigned in the previous 6 hours to the chief medical officer, Dr. Anwar Solano, in the temporary absence of Douglas Vane. The notification was brief, institutional in tone, and said that Hargrove Medical Center was cooperating fully with an ongoing external inquiry, that interim leadership was in place, that all staff should direct questions to HR, and that patient care operations were functioning normally. It said nothing about Vane specifically. It didn't need to. Within 20 minutes, Olivia had received 11 text messages from colleagues, some she'd worked with directly, some she barely knew, most of which contained variations on the same theme. That people had known something was wrong for a long time, that they hadn't said anything, that they were glad something was happening. She read them all. She responded to 3. To Priya, she said, "Thank you for the 11 months." To Dr. Reyes, she said, "The patient in surgical is going to be fine." To Solano, who had sent a single sentence, "Reinstatement confirmed effective 700 tomorrow." She said, "I'll be there." She put the phone down and drove home. The next morning arrived gray and cold, with low cloud cover sitting on the ridge, and the kind of flat light that made everything look provisional. Olivia was at the nursing station on the cardiac floor at 6:50, 10 minutes before her shift, drinking coffee that was marginally better than the coffee she'd been making herself at home. The independent investigators arrived at 9 a.m. and set up in the conference room on the second floor, a different one, not the one with the mountain print and the grief smell. They were methodical and quiet, and worked through their interview list with an efficiency that suggested they had done preliminary review before arriving and knew exactly what they were looking for. They spoke with Priya for 45 minutes, Garrett for an hour and 20. A nursing assistant who had been in the corridor outside the conference room 6 weeks ago for 20 minutes, Dr. Reyes for 30. They spoke with Olivia for 2 hours. She told them everything in the order it happened, with the same precision she used for clinical documentation, facts, timeline, specific language she could attribute to specific people. She told them about the fabricated complaint from Vane's first meeting, the performance review notice, the modified duty assignment, the conversation with Harrison about the camera. She told them what she'd found in the administrative records during her reassignment and how she'd found it. The lead investigator, a woman named Adler, listened without interrupting and asked follow-up questions that were precise enough to tell Olivia that the documentary record she'd submitted was substantially already incorporated. At the end, Adler closed her notebook. Your documentation is the most complete independent record we've encountered in a case of this kind, she said. It's going to matter. I know how to document, Olivia said. Yes. Adler looked at her with the kind of frank assessment that had nothing evaluative in it, just recognition. You do. By noon, the initial findings of the independent investigation had been delivered to the hospital board, which had called an emergency session at 10 and had apparently still been in session at 12:15 when Farr called Olivia to update her. The board accepted the independent findings, Farr said. Vane's employment has been formally terminated, effective as of this morning. They're not calling it a resignation. The termination is for cause, which matters for licensing. Licensing. His administrative licenses are being referred to the state board for review. That process takes time, but the referral is made, which means he can't quietly move to another institution while the inquiry is pending. That's important. She paused. The criminal referral is also confirmed. The DA's office accepted it. Olivia was standing at the window in the break room on the cardiac floor. The ridge was still in cloud. A crow was sitting on the edge of the parking structure, doing nothing in particular. And the staff, she said. Delacroix. The others. The board has voted to conduct a formal review of all HR actions under Vane's administration going back 6 years. Any staff member whose separation is found to have resulted from fabricated documentation will be offered reinstatement or settlement, their choice. Farr's voice was careful, but not without something. The board knows the reputational exposure of not doing this is worse than the cost of doing it. They're motivated. They're motivated by liability. The motivation doesn't matter as much as the outcome in this case. That was probably true. Olivia watched the crow relocate to a different section of parking structure railing. There's one more thing, Farr said. The board has asked Solano to remain in the acting administrator role for a minimum of 60 days while a formal search is conducted. She hasn't accepted yet, but the sense is that she will. A pause. They've also asked whether you would be willing to participate in a staff review panel for the interim administrative period. Review of nursing protocols, direct line to interim leadership. Farr paused again. You're not obligated, but they're asking. I'll think about it, Olivia said. That's a yes, Farr said, with something in her voice that was the closest thing to warmth that a labor attorney operating in professional mode tended to permit herself. Let me think about it, Olivia said. At 3:40 p.m., Douglas Vane was escorted out of Hargrove Medical Center. She didn't witness it directly. She was in the middle of a patient assessment when it happened, but she heard about it afterward from 3 separate people who had, as people in hospitals tended to do with significant events, observed it through windows or from corridor vantages. He'd returned to collect personal items from his office. 2 hospital security staff accompanied him, not because there was a legal requirement, but because the board had determined the optics of unsupervised access to the administrative offices were unacceptable. He'd come in through the employee entrance. He'd been in the building for 41 minutes. When he came back through the lobby with a box of personal items, the kind of scene that Olivia had seen in institutional contexts before, the box always looking smaller than the person carrying it expected, there were people in the lobby, not gathered, not deliberately positioned, just there, in the way hospital lobbies were always populated. But they saw him, and they knew, and the knowing moved through the space in the particular way awareness moved through collective environments, without announcement, without drama, like a current underwater. He walked out through the front entrance in the flat gray afternoon light. Nobody said anything. That was, in its way, its own verdict. Fletcher Malone was moved from Hargrove to a federal medical facility the following morning, which was standard protocol given his status in the ongoing inquiry. Before his transfer, he requested to speak with the nurse who had intervened during his collapse. Olivia went to his room at 7 a.m. before her shift began. He was sitting up, better color, better alertness, the particular improvement of a cardiac patient who had made it past the acute window and was now in the slower work of recovery. He was a big man, with the kind of bearing that persisted even in a hospital gown, and he looked at her when she came in with the attention of someone who had been told something about her and was now calibrating it against what he saw. "You're smaller than I expected," he said. "People say that," she said. "I've been told you have a history." "I have a nursing career," she said. 6 years. He studied her. "And before that?" She didn't answer. He nodded slowly, accepting the non-answer with the ease of a man who understood that some information didn't travel through certain channels. "I was told your intervention was decisive," he said. "Clinically. It was appropriate." That's a modest word. It's an accurate one. He was quiet for a moment. What's happening here, in this facility, is connected to something I've spent 2 years working toward. I can't tell you the specifics, but I want you to know that what you observed in those administrative records and the way you handled it made a material difference to people whose names you'll likely never know. She looked at him. I was doing assigned work, she said, administrative support, supply coordination, documentation review. The corner of his mouth moved. Right, he said. Get some rest, she said. The transfer team will be here early. She went back to her floor. No. At 11 a.m., Priya called a quiet meeting of the cardiac floor nursing staff in the break room. 8 nurses, 2 nursing assistants, the overnight charge. They stood around with coffee cups and the collective tiredness of people who had run a sustained sprint and were now arriving at whatever came after. I want to say something, Priya said, which was how she started things she'd been thinking about for a while. I should have said it publicly before. I didn't. She looked at Olivia, who was standing near the coffee machine with her arms crossed, and the expression of a person who was approximately 45 seconds away from deflecting. What happened to Olivia was visible. Most of us saw it or knew about it, and most of us... She stopped. Most of us made a calculation about what the cost of speaking up was, and we decided it was too high. She looked at the group. That was wrong. The room was quiet. The cost of speaking up should not be that high, Priya continued. And the fact that it was... That's the thing we should be angry about. Not just at him, at the structure that made it feel impossible. More quiet. One of the nurses, a young woman named Fenwick, who'd been at Hargrove for less than a year, said, "What do we do now?" Priya looked at Olivia. "Now," Olivia said, "we make it harder for this to happen again. Review panels, documentation protocols, direct reporting channels that don't run through administrative leadership." She paused. "The board is open to it right now because they're managing exposure. We use that window while it exists. And if the next administrator is the same, then we're more prepared than we were this time," Olivia said. "That's not a perfect answer. It's just the true one." Fenwick nodded slowly. The others held the weight of that in varying degrees of resolution. "Okay," Priya said. "Back to work." They went back to work. At 2 p.m., Farr sent a message with 3 lines. Delacroix accepted reinstatement. Quaid accepted. Brecca is still deciding. Then, also, Vane's legal counsel withdrew cooperation offer. Apparently he's fighting it. Then, which means he doesn't understand what he's fighting. Olivia read the messages at the nurse's station and put her phone back in her pocket. She picked up the chart she'd been reviewing. She made a note. She moved to the next patient. She was halfway through the assessment when her pager went off. Not her department page, but the administrator's office extension, which she hadn't received a page from in 2 days because there had been no administrator. She looked at the pager number. Acting Administrator Solano. She finished the assessment, made a note, handed the chart to the covering nurse, and went to the elevator. Solano's office, Vane's old office, now stripped of its certificate density and with the window open despite the cold, was occupied by Solano herself and a man Olivia didn't recognize immediately. Late 40s, civilian clothes, the kind of quiet that wasn't shyness but deliberate economy. "Sit down," Solano said. Olivia sat. "This is Agent Marbury," Solano said. "Federal. He's not here about the financial inquiry." Marbury looked at Olivia with the measured attention of someone who had prepared for this conversation carefully. "Ms. Hart, we've been reviewing the circumstances of General Malone's collapse, including your clinical intervention and your subsequent cooperation with Colonel Donohue's team." He paused. "We've also been reviewing the administrative records you encountered during your reassignment." "I was doing assigned work," she said. "Yes." He didn't dispute it. "There's a vendor in those records, the one whose invoices don't correspond to documented service. We've traced it." He paused in a way that meant the next sentence was the point of the conversation. "The vendor doesn't exist as a licensed entity. It's a shell registered in a state where disclosure requirements are minimal. The payments went through 3 accounts before reaching a destination we've confirmed." She looked at him. "What destination?" "An account associated with a regulatory official at the State Health Board," Marbury said. The official responsible for approving Hargrove's accreditation submissions for the past 4 years. The room was very still. Vane wasn't just manipulating records for internal purposes, Olivia said. No, Marbury said. He was paying someone to approve them at the regulatory level, which means the fraud isn't contained to this hospital. There are other facilities in the region whose accreditation has gone through the same official. He looked at her steadily. We're talking about a systematic corruption of the regional healthcare regulatory process. Multiple facilities, multiple falsified safety records. Olivia sat with that. The full weight of it was different from the weight of Vane's conduct against individual staff members. Larger in scope, more distributed in harm, the kind of thing that didn't have a single face the way the conference room incident did. What does this mean for the investigation? She said. It means it expanded this morning, Marbury said. Significantly. He paused. And it means that what you found in those records, and the way you flagged it through appropriate channels, is now the evidentiary cornerstone of a federal case that goes well beyond Douglas Vane. Solano was watching Olivia with the particular attention she'd used during the mass casualty response, reading, assessing, making her own calculations. You're not surprised, Solano said. I suspected the pattern was external, Olivia said. The accreditation numbers were too consistently wrong to be internal error. Someone was validating what shouldn't have been validated. Solano looked at Marbury. Marbury looked at Olivia. There's one more thing, Marbury said. The shell company has a secondary registered agent, someone who set it up 6 years ago, before Vane came to Hargrove. We've traced that registration. He opened the folder he'd been holding on his knee. He turned it to face her. Olivia looked at the name on the document. It was a name she recognized. Not from Hargrove. Not from anything in Iron Ridge. From 8 years ago, from a context so removed from this building and this afternoon that the recognition arrived with a kind of physical jolt. The specific vertigo of a world she had deliberately left reaching back across time to find her in a Colorado hospital where she had been trying for 11 quiet months to just be a nurse. She looked up at Marbury. His expression said he already knew she recognized it. We're going to need to talk, he said, about some things that happened before you came here. The name on the document was Harlan Stovics. She hadn't heard it spoken in 4 years, hadn't seen it written in longer. She'd spent a deliberate amount of energy ensuring it stayed in the past where she'd filed it, in the section of her memory that held things that were finished and ought to remain so. Apparently Harlan Stovics had not made the same choice about her. How long? She said. Marbury knew what she was asking. The secondary registration is 6 years old, which predates your arrival here by 5 years. So the connection to this specific facility wasn't about you initially. He paused. But the shell company's activity increased approximately 14 months ago, 1 month before you took the position at Hargrove. 14 months. She'd been hired 11 months ago, which meant the activity had increased during the application period, during the background check, during the hiring process that she'd believed was routine. He knew I was coming here, she said. That's the working theory. Solano was very still in her chair. She was not a person who interrupted things she was still processing, which was one of the things Olivia had come to respect about her in a short time. What is Stovics connected to? Olivia said. Specifically, we can't discuss in this setting. Generally, Marbury chose his words with the care of someone who had a hard line about what he'd say in rooms that weren't classified. He is a person with significant interest in certain operational records that involve your service history, records that would be damaging to him if they became part of a federal proceeding. He thought I was building a case against him. He thought your presence here, in proximity to people connected to the Malone inquiry, was not coincidental. Marbury looked at her steadily. He was wrong about your motivation. He wasn't entirely wrong about the proximity. She sat with that. The mechanics of it assembled themselves in her mind with the cold, geometric clarity of something that had been true for months without her knowing the shape of it. Stovics had learned she was at Hargrove, had escalated the shell company activity, possibly to insulate himself, possibly to muddy the financial trail, possibly both. And somewhere in that escalation, Vane had become both tool and liability. Vane knew about Stovics, she said. Vane knew he was being paid to approve falsified accreditation. He didn't know the full structure behind it. He was a node, not the architect. Marbury closed the folder. Stovix made a fundamental error. He assumed that because you'd left your previous world voluntarily, you were neutralized. He didn't account for the possibility that a person with your training, placed in proximity to his financial infrastructure, would find it in the course of doing ordinary work. I was filing supply invoices, Olivia said. Yes, Marbury said. You were. The absurdity of it and the gravity of it occupied the same space, which was something she'd encountered before, the way enormous things often turned on the most unremarkable pivot points. 8 years of operational experience, and what had unraveled a 6-year corruption scheme was a woman on modified duty sorting administrative backlogs, because a vindictive administrator had run out of ways to demote her without firing her. Stovix is in custody, Marbury said. As of this morning, the shell company evidence, combined with material that was already under seal in a separate inquiry, was sufficient for an arrest warrant. He paused. His attorneys will attempt to challenge the chain of discovery. They will argue that the administrative records you accessed were outside your assigned scope. I have the coordinator's email, she said. The specific task assignment, date and time stamped. We have it. FAR provided it this morning. He almost smiled. Your documentation practice is thorough. I know, she said. Solano spoke for the first time in several minutes. What does this mean for Hargrove, for the staff here? The federal inquiry will require cooperation from the hospital's records for some period, Marbury said. The institution itself is a crime scene in terms of the financial evidence, not a criminal actor. Provided the board cooperates fully, which it is doing, the operational impact should be manageable. He looked at Olivia. The accreditation question is more complex. Several quarters of falsified safety reporting means the regional board will need to conduct an independent audit. That takes time. But Solano's appointment as acting administrator and the voluntary disclosure posture the board has taken will be significant factors in how that process goes. Solano absorbed this. How long? Months, not years. She nodded. We'll manage. Marbury stood. He extended his hand to Olivia. Ms. Hart, your country owes you a debt it can't officially acknowledge, for reasons I suspect you understand better than most. He paused. What you did here, both the clinical work and the rest of it, is going to matter to people whose names you'll never see. She shook his hand. I was doing my job, she said. He nodded once with the specific recognition of someone who understood exactly how much that sentence contained. He left. The office was quiet. Solano looked at Olivia across the desk, not the desk positioned for dominance, but pushed to the side with 2 chairs angled toward each other, which was a choice Solano had made on her first day in the role and which said something accurate about her. I'm not going to ask about the history, Solano said. I appreciate that. But I am going to ask about the future. Solano leaned forward slightly. The review panel, the nursing protocol work, I need someone who will tell me when the administration is wrong, not when they think the administration wants to hear that they're right. She paused. That turns out to be a harder quality to find than it should be. Olivia looked at her. I'm a nurse. That's what I want to be doing. I know, the panel is 8 hours a month. The rest of the time you're on the cardiac floor. Solano met her eyes. I'm not trying to make you something you're not. I'm trying to make use of what you already are. Olivia was quiet for a moment. 8 hours a month, she said. Confirmed. All right. Solano nodded. Go back to your patients. The formal staff assembly happened 9 days later. Not because anyone had planned it as a ceremony. It grew out of a board-mandated all-staff briefing about the investigation outcomes and the interim administrative structure, which Solano had scheduled with the practical efficiency of someone who understood that people needed official information delivered by a real person rather than through the institutional grapevine. But somewhere between the scheduling and the morning it happened, it had become something more than a briefing. The assembly room held 200 people and had all 200 in it. Clinical staff, administrative staff, facilities, the overnight shifts that had come in specifically for this. Olivia stood near the back, which was where she'd positioned herself, and watched the room fill with the particular density of a community that had been living under something heavy and was still figuring out how to stand fully upright without it. Solano opened with the facts, which was the right choice. No preamble, no institutional language designed to soften edges. The investigation findings, the confirmed misconduct, the federal charges, the independent HR review outcomes, the reinstatement offers extended to former staff, the regulatory audit timeline. She said all of it plainly, and the room absorbed it in the specific silence of people who had suspected most of it and were now having the suspicion confirmed officially, which felt different even when it shouldn't. When she finished the factual section, she paused. "I want to say something that is not part of the official record," Solano said. "What happened here over the past several years was not invisible. People saw it, and most people made the reasonable, human, understandable calculation that speaking up wasn't survivable." She looked at the room. "I'm not here to judge that calculation. I've made versions of it myself in my career. What I'm here to say is that the calculation only works when the institution makes it the rational choice. And it was our failure, the failure of every level of institutional leadership, that it was ever rational to stay silent in this building." The room was still. "One person did not make that calculation," Solano said. "Or rather, she made it differently. She documented. She persisted. She did her clinical work with a standard that ultimately made it impossible for the people trying to dismiss her to sustain the dismissal." Solano looked toward the back of the room. Olivia Hart. Olivia had known this was coming. She had not fully prepared for the way it felt, not the applause, which started in the front and moved back through the room with the particular warmth of people who had been waiting to express something they hadn't had the structure to express before. The applause was fine. She could manage applause. It was the faces. The nursing assistant who had looked away in the corridor that first day. The doctor who'd sent a text message 9 days ago saying I should have said something sooner. Priya, who was crying in the way Priya cried, quickly, efficiently, wiping it away as a professional obligation. Dr. Reyes, who was not crying, but whose expression was doing something in that vicinity. Margot Delacroix was in the room. She had driven from the city where she'd been working her non-clinical job for 3 years. She was standing near the left wall, and she looked at Olivia across the assembly with the expression of a person who has been carrying something alone for a long time and has just, tentatively, set it down. Olivia raised one hand, not a wave exactly, something more minimal, and held eye contact for a moment. Delacroix nodded. It wasn't resolution exactly. 3 years of a career interrupted and a life redirected didn't dissolve because one person had finally done what should have been done earlier. Olivia knew that. Delacroix knew that. The nod acknowledged it without pretending otherwise. When the applause ended, Solano said, "Back to work." And 200 people went back to work. 3 weeks after the assembly, Douglas Vane appeared before a federal magistrate in Denver. The charges? Wire fraud, falsification of federal health records, workplace assault, and conspiracy were read into the official record in a courtroom that had a reporter from 2 regional outlets and 1 national wire service in the gallery. Olivia was not there. She was on the cardiac floor working a full shift, and she learned about it from Farr's message at 4 p.m. He entered a not guilty plea. His attorneys are still looking for a procedural angle. They won't find one. She read the message, put her phone away, and went to check on a patient who'd been asking for her. A week after that, the State Health Board completed its preliminary audit of the accreditation submissions under the falsified records period. The findings, distributed to the board, to the federal investigators, and to the Regional Hospital Association, confirmed what the financial evidence had indicated. 7/4 of approved safety submissions that didn't match actual incident data. 2 other facilities in the region under the same regulatory official had similar discrepancies, though the degree varied. The regulatory official in question had been removed from her position the morning after Stavic's arrest and was cooperating with the federal inquiry in exchange for considerations that were still being negotiated. Her cooperation was expected to be substantial. Harlan Stavic's legal team was attempting to challenge the shell company evidence on discovery grounds. Marbury had called Olivia once, briefly, to confirm that the coordinator's email assigning her the administrative work remained central to the chain of custody argument, and that it was holding. She thanked him. He said, "Don't thank me." She said, "I wasn't thanking you specifically." He'd almost laughed. which for Marbury was essentially the same as laughing. The cases moved through their channels. These things took time. She understood that. She'd spent enough years around processes that took time to have stopped expecting them to resolve on the timeline of urgency rather than the timeline of institutions. What she watched instead, in the weeks following, was the smaller things. The things that didn't make it into official records or legal proceedings, but that constituted the actual texture of a place changing. A new anonymous reporting system installed outside HR, with a direct line to the independent review panel. A mandatory bystander training module for all supervisory staff. Not the kind that existed on paper and was forgotten, but the kind that Solano had made Priya help design, which meant it had the fingerprints of someone who understood what bystander failure actually looked like from the inside. A staffing audit that found 3 positions on the cardiac floor that had been listed as filled in accreditation submissions and were, in reality, vacant. Positions that were now actually filled, with 2 new nurses who started on a Tuesday in October. Fenwick, the young nurse who'd asked, "What do we do now?" became the floor's unofficial documentation lead, the person newer staff went to when they weren't sure how to record something ambiguous or difficult. She was meticulous and slightly anxious about it, which Olivia thought was probably the right combination. Garrett, after 2 weeks of visible discomfort, gave a voluntary statement to the independent investigators that was substantially more complete than his initial account. He was not cleared of passive complicity, but the investigators had noted his cooperation. He remained employed. He walked differently now. Not smaller, exactly, but with the specific awareness of a person who understood the weight of what they'd once been willing to carry without complaint. Harrison's resignation stood. He didn't return. In the second week of November, Betts was discharged. Olivia walked her to the exit, not because it was required, not because there was any protocol that said so, but because Betts had been in the building for 3 weeks and had watched everything with the sharp lateral attention of a woman who had seen enough of life to recognize when something significant was happening around her, and she deserved a proper goodbye from someone who'd been paying attention back. At the entrance, Betts stopped and looked at her. "My husband," she said. "He never talked about what he'd done either. Wouldn't take the credit. Drove me absolutely mad for 31 years. She paused. "I used to think it was a kind of stubbornness, that he was refusing the acknowledgement out of pride." "And now?" Olivia said. Betts considered. "Now I think it was simpler than that. He just knew what he'd done didn't require anyone else's confirmation to be real." She looked at Olivia steadily. "I think you know the same thing. I think you've known it for a long time." Olivia looked at the entrance doors, at the parking lot beyond, at the ordinary Colorado afternoon. "Take care of yourself," she said. "You too, dear," Betts said, "and eat a proper lunch occasionally. You never eat a proper lunch." She walked out. The doors closed. Olivia stood in the lobby for a moment. The review panel met for the first time on a Thursday evening in late November, in a conference room that wasn't the one with the mountain print and not the one where Vane had sat across from her 6 weeks ago. It was a different room, smaller, with a whiteboard and a window that faced the ridge rather than the parking lot, an actual decent coffee that Solano had apparently identified as a non-negotiable in the interim administration budget. There were 7 people around the table: Solano, Priya, Reyes, 2 nurses from surgical and the emergency department respectively, a facilities representative, and Olivia. They were there to review the proposed nursing protocol revisions and the anonymous reporting structure and 3 specific procedural gaps that the independent audit had identified. The work was unglamorous. It was the work of building something better out of the wreckage of something worse, which required attention to the kind of detail that didn't make it into any narrative but determined whether the thing actually held. It was the kind of work Olivia was good at. Not because of training, though the training was there, not because of her service history, though that had shaped her in ways that would never fully unwind, but because she had spent 8 years learning what happened when systems failed, when the person in charge prioritized their own position over the welfare of the people below them, when documentation became a tool of concealment instead of accountability, when the cost of speaking became so high that silence became rational. And she had come to understand, with a specificity that wasn't ideological but simply practical, that the only reliable prevention was structure, clear structure, documented, enforced. Accountable to people outside the chain it was meant to regulate. You couldn't rely on individuals being good. You built things that made it harder for individuals to be bad. They worked for 2 hours. At the end, Solano said, "Same time in 2 weeks," and everyone agreed, and the coffee cups were collected, and the building settled into its evening quiet. Olivia walked to her car through the parking lot. The ridge was dark against the sky. That specific Colorado dark that was more presence than absence, the mountains holding their shape against whatever light remained. She stood beside her car for a moment without getting in. She thought about what Betts had said, about confirmation, about what it meant to know the value of what you'd done without requiring someone else to ratify it for you. She had not come to Hargrove Medical Center to fix anything. She had come to do a specific thing: care for patients, keep her hands useful, live a smaller and quieter life than the one she'd left. She had not planned for Douglas Vane. She had not planned for Harlan Stavix reaching across 4 years to find her here, or for Fletcher Malone collapsing in a corridor, or for the particular chain of cause and effect that had turned 11 months of careful documentation into the evidentiary foundation of a federal case. She had just done what she knew how to do. She had moved through it the way she moved through everything, one decision at a time, each one made on the available information, each one documented, each one defensible. She had not been a hero. She had been a person who kept doing her job when someone with power over her livelihood had made that very difficult, and who had refused to let the difficulty become a reason to stop. That was not special. It shouldn't have been special. The fact that it registered as unusual said more about how low the bar had been set than about how high she'd cleared it. But she'd cleared it. And in clearing it, she'd cleared something for Delacroix, and for Quaid, and for Brecca, and for the charge nurse who'd left before she'd arrived, and whose name she'd found in an HR complaint log on a fourth-floor administrative computer during an afternoon of assigned supply coordination. She got in the car. She sat there for a moment. She had spent a long time being underestimated. By Vane, most recently and most visibly, but before that by others in other contexts. People who saw the surface of her and concluded that the surface was all there was. It was a specific kind of blindness, the kind that came from needing people to be smaller than they were, because smaller people were easier to manage. She had never wasted energy being angry about it. Anger was a resource, and she'd learned to allocate resources carefully. What she'd done instead was exactly what she'd told Margot Delacroix on the phone. She'd kept moving. Not toward anything dramatic or conclusive, just forward, one careful step, with everything documented. The thing about being underestimated, she had found, was this: the person doing the underestimating always revealed more than they intended. Vane had shown her exactly how he operated: the fabricated paper trails, the targeted pressure, the escalation to remove, because he'd never imagined she was watching and remembering and writing things down. Stovix had assumed she was neutralized because she'd chosen a quiet life, not understanding that the choice of quiet was a tactic, not a surrender. Even the federal investigators had arrived expecting to find someone who needed their help, and found instead someone who had been building their case for them across 11 months of ordinary shifts. She started the car. The ridge disappeared in the rearview mirror as she pulled out of the lot, replaced by the lit windows of the hospital rising behind her. All those floors, all those rooms, all those people working the late shift in the specific way hospital workers worked, which was with the particular dedication of people who had chosen a profession that asked everything and offered limited gratitude in return. She had chosen it deliberately. She chose it again every morning she walked through those doors, not because it was easy, not because it was safe or certain or free from the kind of people who used institutions to harm the people within them. Because it was necessary. Because there were patients who needed care, and floors that needed good nurses, and systems that needed people willing to document what was true rather than what was convenient. Because the work was real in a way that other things in her life hadn't always been. The patient either stabilized or didn't. The documentation was either accurate or wasn't. The structure either held or required repair. She drove home through the flat Colorado night. 3 weeks later, the nursing protocol revisions went into effect at Hargrove Medical Center. The new reporting system received its first anonymous submission on the second day. A minor concern about shift scheduling pressure. The kind of thing that would previously have gone nowhere and instead went to Priya's review panel and was resolved in 4 days. Small, unglamorous. Exactly right. Douglas Vane's trial date was set for the following spring. Harlan Stovics entered a guilty plea in December on terms that the federal investigators described to Olivia in a brief call from Marbury as comprehensive. She asked what that meant specifically. He said it meant the records that had endangered her were now part of a sealed federal proceeding that would ensure they never endangered anyone again. She thanked him. This time she meant it. Margot Delacroix returned to clinical nursing in January. Not at Hargrove. She chose a different facility, which Olivia understood completely, but in the same region, in an emergency department, doing the work she'd been trained to do and that had been taken from her for 3 years by a man who had mistaken her compliance for weakness and her departure for defeat. She sent Olivia a message on the day she started. One line, back where I belong. Olivia read it at the nurse's station on the cardiac floor between a medication round and a patient assessment, while the monitors beeped their ordinary rhythms and the morning light came through the windows at the angle that meant the cloud cover had finally broken and the ridge was visible again, snow on the upper elevations. The kind of view that made people want to say something about it and usually said nothing because it was more than language easily handled. She typed back, good. She put the phone in her pocket. She went to see her patients. There was no moment when everything became fine. That was the thing about justice, real justice. The kind that didn't exist in courtroom speeches or public vindications, but in the accumulated incremental work of fixing what had been broken. It didn't arrive like a door opening. It arrived like a structural repair, like the difference between a wall that holds and a wall that failed. You didn't feel the holding, you felt the absence of the collapse. Olivia Hart had never wanted to be a symbol of anything. She had wanted to be a nurse. She was still a nurse. She was also now a person who had demonstrated something in a building full of witnesses and in a federal record that would outlast everyone in the room. That the people who are dismissed as ordinary are often dismissed because they make the person doing the dismissing feel safer than they have any right to feel. Strength that doesn't perform itself is invisible until it isn't. And when it becomes visible, the people who built their authority on the assumption of its absence have nowhere left to stand. She had not taught Douglas Vane that lesson. He was past the point of learning it. She had demonstrated it to every person in that building who had watched and stayed silent and made their calculation, the nurses and the assistants and the department heads and the residents, that the calculation was wrong, that the cost of silence was always higher than it looked in the moment, that the person you don't speak up for today becomes the version of yourself you don't recognize tomorrow. She had done it without making a speech, without demanding acknowledgement, without waiting for someone to hand her permission. She had just kept doing her job. And when the moment came, when the room revealed itself for what it was, and the people in it had to decide what they were, she had already built, in 11 months of careful, ordinary work, everything she needed to be exactly where she stood. That was the truth of it, not the footage, not the federal charges, not the commendations or the assembly or the applause. The truth was simpler and less dramatic. She had shown up. Every day. She had done the work. She had told the truth in the documentation when telling the truth was inconvenient and potentially dangerous, because the documentation was the patient's record, and the patient's record was not a political instrument. She had been a nurse. Everything else followed from that.